Okay, guys. Today we're going to be starting on chapter 16. We're going to spend about 3 days on chapter 16, so that will be today, and we're also going to go ahead and do that tomorrow, and then we'll finish up chapter 16 next week. Also, don't forget, tomorrow you are going to have, in addition to a video and some questions to answer about the second part of chapter 16, you're also going to have a quiz over lab exercises 17 and 18, and then don't forget on Friday you will have your third lab exam. And that will be over lab exercises 12 through 15 as well as 17 and 18. So if you haven't yet, make sure you have your lab handouts completed because I will be getting diagrams from those handouts as well as questions from those handouts or diagrams very similar to the ones on those handouts. So please let me know if you have any questions about the lab quiz that you're having tomorrow or the lab exam that you'll be having on Friday this week. Okay, so we are still, again, for the rest of the semester, we will continue talking about the nervous system. Today we're going to be talking about the autonomic nervous system. So if we go back and we review the divisions of the nervous system, remember the central nervous system contains your brain and spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system contains all of the nerves that connect your body to your brain and spinal cord, and those nerves are going to be our 12 pair of cranial nerves as well as our 31 pair of spinal nerves. And then remember that we have several different divisions of that peripheral nervous system. The sensory division, of course, is going to contain the sensory receptors in your skin, your eyes, your ears, your nose, your mouth, and then the sensory neurons that connect those receptors to your CNS, your central nervous system. And then the other division of the peripheral nervous system is going to be the motor division, and this is composed of those multipolar motor neurons. Remember, your sensory neurons are mostly pseudo-unipolar, but your motor neurons are generally multipolar. And remember that motor division is going to be conducting signals from your brain and spinal cord, your central nervous system, to effector organs. These effector organs include skeletal muscles as well as cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. So when we look at that motor division, we actually have two divisions of that motor division of the peripheral nervous system, and that's going to be the somatic and the autonomic nervous system. Remember that your somatic nervous system is concerned with controlling your voluntary movements. That's going to be your skeletal muscles. So those somatic motor neurons innervate and tell your skeletal muscles to contract. And what we're going to be focusing on in chapter 16 is your autonomic nervous system. So this is going to be the nervous system that controls your involuntary responses. Again, the neurons, it includes those motor neurons that innervate and stimulate your skeletal, I'm sorry, not your skeletal muscle, but your cardiac muscle, your smooth muscle, and your glands. And if we look, we see that the autonomic nervous system is divided into two different divisions as well, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic division. The sympathetic division is concerned with the fight or flight response. So this is what regulates your body in times of stress or excitement or danger. Whereas the parasympathetic is concerned more with the rest and digest response. So this is the part of the autonomic nervous system that is regulating your body in times of rest and relaxation. So we're going to be first of all, we're going to be comparing the autonomic and somatic nervous systems, and then we will be going on to compare the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions of that autonomic nervous system. So again, as we just went over, the autonomic nervous system is going to be concerned with regulating the involuntary functions, the involuntary muscle, the cardiac muscle, the smooth muscle, as well as glands, as opposed to the somatic, which regulates your voluntary muscles. That's going to be your skeletal muscle. So again, that autonomic nervous system is going to be concerned with maintaining homeostasis by regulating things like your heart rate, your breathing, your body temperature, your digestion, your urinary functions, things like that. And again, it is innervating your smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, as well as glands. And as we said previously, the sympathetic division of that autonomic, ANS here is autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic division is concerned with that fight or flight response, and the parasympathetic division is concerned with the rest and digest response. We probably will also briefly talk about the enteric nervous system, which is also considered to be a third division of that autonomic nervous system. And this is going to be all of the nerves that are associated specifically with just the digestive digestive tract. But again, mainly we're going to be talking about the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems in this chapter. So again, remember that your nerves, your cranial and spinal nerves, those peripheral nerves contain both sensory and motor neurons. So they're not necessarily strictly one or the other. Now, we do know some of those cranial nerves, like the optic nerve, the olfactory nerve, those are strictly sensory nerves. But most of your cranial and spinal nerves are going to be both sensory and motor. Again, remember that motor neurons are going to be carrying information from your central nervous system to effector organs such as muscles and glands. So again, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, as well as glands. And then, of course, if it was a somatic motor neuron, it would be carrying it to skeletal muscle. But our autonomic motor neurons are going to be carrying it to cardiac and smooth muscle as well as glands. And then remember, our somatic nerves are going to be just for innervating our skeletal muscle. Remember that sensory neurons carry information from the sensory receptors in your skin, in your eye, in your ear, in your nose, in your mouth to your brain and spinal cord. So they are carrying these stimuli from your environment to your central nervous system, and then those motor neurons are carrying information from your central nervous system out to those effector organs to cause your body to respond to whatever you sensed in your environment. Also remember that nerves are bundles of axons. And again, those axons, those nerve cells in those nerves can be somatic. They can be autonomic. So again, they can be motor, either somatic motor or autonomic motor, or they can be sensory. So again, a nerve doesn't necessarily just contain one type of motor neuron. It can have a variety of different ones from these different, both sensory and motor. So again, we want to compare and contrast the somatic with the autonomic nervous system. We've already talked about somatic when we talked about just the nerves in general. The somatic nervous system, those somatic nerves are going to innervate and control, as we said earlier, skeletal muscle. Mainly, it is concerned with that voluntary muscle movement, so the muscle movement that you have conscious control over. But there is some unconscious movement there as well, such as your reflexes. So again, reflexes are involuntary responses to a stimulus, and so motor neurons are used there. Skeletal muscles are innervated to cause those reflexes to happen. Like we talked about the stretch reflex and the crossed extensor reflex and reciprocal innervation and things like that. So again, those reflexes would probably be the main involuntary movements that we're referring to here. The somatic nervous system is mainly going to be concerned with those conscious voluntary movements. And when these somatic motor neurons send a signal to that skeletal muscle, they cause it to contract. So they're always going to be excitatory. Those somatic motor neurons are going to be releasing acetylcholine, and that is always going to be excitatory, meaning exciting, stimulating that muscle to contract. Again, it does involve just one neuron running from the CNS to the skeletal muscle, and it is going to be a myelinated neuron. Again, so we're going to be, these somatic motor neurons are going to be able to conduct those electrical signals really quickly to allow you to respond to your environment, because again, this is life or death. You have to be able to respond to your environment. Again, the cell bodies are in the central nervous system, so, we're not going to be looking at ganglia and stuff like that, as we'll see with the autonomic nervous system. Again, the neurotransmitter that's going to be released from these somatic motor neurons is going to be acetylcholine, or that ACH, always. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but the receptor molecules of the somatic motor neurons are always nicotinic receptor molecules. Okay, so now to look at a few differences between the somatic and the autonomic. First of all, with the autonomic, the effector organs are going to be the smooth cardiac muscle as well as glands, and we've already said that. Also, with autonomic, it's going to be concerned strictly with involuntary movements, involuntary or unconscious regulation of movements, as opposed, remember that somatic is mainly controlled with those voluntary conscious movements. And where we said that the somatic is always excitatory, well, with the autonomic, it can be excitatory or inhibitory. And we'll see that more a little bit later, but we can see that in some cases, the heart can be stimulated to beat faster, the breathing can be stimulated to go have faster, but in other cases, for example, the digestion can be inhibited. So instead of stimulating it, that those digestive organs to contract and digest the food, they can actually be inhibited. So we can have these autonomic motor neurons can have either an inhibitory or a stimulatory effect on those effector organs. Also, as we said, the somatic involves one neuron leading from the CNS to the skeletal muscle to cause the skeletal muscle to contract. With our autonomic nervous system, we see there are two neurons. There are always going to be two neurons involved. Those two neurons, the first one is called the preganglionic, and then the second one is called the postganglionic. Okay, and basically what we're going to see is that there are going to be these ganglia, as I mentioned earlier. With our somatic motor neurons, the cell bodies are in the central nervous system, but with your autonomic, not all of the cell bodies are in the central nervous system. Some of the cell bodies of those postganglionic neurons are in ganglia. So we're going to talk about several different types of ganglia. A ganglion is just a cluster of cell bodies where you have neurons synapsing. You have the preganglionic neuron synapsing with the postganglionic neuron. So again, two neurons are going to be involved. Two of these motor neurons are going to be involved in this autonomic nervous system, in both your sympathetic and your parasympathetic. And we will look at some differences between the preganglionic and postganglionic neurons of the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic today. When you're looking at the preganglionic neuron is going to generally be small and be myelinated. So again, able to carry those electrical signals from the CNS to that ganglion very quickly. And then the postganglionic is going to be unmyelinated. So it's not going to have as much myelin on it, and so it will be carrying information a little bit more slowly from the ganglion to the effector organs, such as the cardiac muscles, smooth muscle, or glands. When it comes to those preganglionic neurons, acetylcholine is always going to be the neurotransmitter that is released by those preganglionic neurons. But when it comes to the postganglionic neurons, in some cases, for example, when we are looking, I think it's at the sympathetic nervous system, the acetylcholine will also be released by those postganglionic neurons. But when we're looking at the parasympathetic nervous system, it's actually epinephrine or norepinephrine that is released by those, or no, it may be the other way around. It may be that the parasympathetic releases the norepinephrine, or I'm sorry, the sympathetic postganglionic releases the norepinephrine, and then the parasympathetic postganglionic releases the acetylcholine. I don't remember for sure, so if we don't talk about it in the PowerPoint, then I know there's like 3 crash course videos that I really think you should watch. I can't show them in this video because YouTube will block this video if I do, because those are copyrighted, but I do have the videos in the PowerPoint, so if you will go to the PowerPoint and click on those videos, I really think it's a good idea that you watch them. There's probably 25 minutes of video. I think one of the videos is like 8 minutes and the other 2 are about like 10. But again, he stops talking about the information like a couple minutes before the end of the video. So I'm thinking around 20 to 25 minutes of videos if you want to get a better understanding of this, because he has a way of just explaining it and relating it to things that you can relate to that may make it easier for you to understand. So I would definitely go and watch those crash course videos, and he will talk about the neurotransmitters that are released. Again, it's always going to be acetylcholine released by the preganglionic neurons, and then the postganglionic neurons, in one of them, either sympathetic or parasympathetic, it's acetylcholine being released by the postganglionic neuron, and then in the other division of the autonomic nervous system, it's going to be norepinephrine being released by the postganglionic neurons. And then again, we said that for the somatic motor neurons, the receptor molecules are nicotinic, but with the autonomic motor neurons, the receptor molecules can be nicotinic, muscarinic, or adrenergic, and we'll talk more about that, I think, tomorrow, not today. And then again, you can't really see it down here very well because it's almost cut off. But again, as we said, it can be excitatory or inhibitory. So as we kind of said that up here, the target tissues, the smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or glands can be stimulated or inhibited. So it can be excitatory or inhibitory. Okay, so this is the first video that I was talking about. I can't show it here, again, because YouTube will block my video if I do. But go to the PowerPoint and watch this video. This is like an 8-minute video, and he probably stops with the new information a couple of minutes before the end of the video. So, go spend 5 or 6 minutes and watch this, because this is a really good overview of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so as we can see here, again, comparing and contrasting the somatic and autonomic nervous systems. Again, with the somatic, we have one nerve. This is a spinal nerve here. We have one nerve going from the spinal cord to the skeletal muscle. Again, from the CNS to the skeletal muscle, controlling conscious, voluntary movements here for the most part. With our autonomic, we have not one but two nerves. They synapse in a ganglion. So here we go from the CNS to the ganglion with the first, this is the preganglionic neuron, and then from the ganglion to the effector organ, which might be smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or a gland, with the postganglionic neuron. So again, two neurons involved, and they synapse in a ganglion most of the time. Okay, so we're going to start out looking at the sympathetic nervous system first. The sympathetic nervous system is called thoracocolumbar. The reason for this is because it includes the spinal nerves T1 through L2, or the thoracic and lumbar regions of those spinal nerves. So the cell bodies of the preganglionic neuron. Again, here we can see the preganglionic is solid, and the postganglionic neuron is the dotted line, just like we had here. The preganglionic is the solid line, the postganglionic is the dotted line. So here you can see all of those preganglionic neurons are arising from T1 to L2. So they're all arising from kind of the middle there of your spinal cord, those spinal nerves T1 through L2. And so that's why it's called thoracocolumbar. We will see that with our parasympathetic, those arise from they are called craniosacral. Those nerves are, those preganglionic neurons, because they arrive from, again, your cranial area and then your sacral area. So above the sympathetic spinal nerves and below the sympathetic spinal nerves is where those parasympathetic arise from the spinal cord. So that's why we call them thoracocolumbar. All right, continuing on, the preganglionic neuron, those axons will exit through white rami communicans, and those are going to be between the spinal nerve and the chain ganglia. So here we have chain ganglia, and so these are going to be the white rami communicans. This is what they're running through right here, the white rami communicans. And they will go either, these preganglionic neurons will either go to the sympathetic chain ganglia, which are what these are, kind of looking like a chain. Those are called the chain ganglia, and there those preganglionic, those sympathetic preganglionic neurons will synapse with the postganglionic neuron. So you can see you have the solid preganglionic coming into the chain ganglia, and then you have the dotted line postganglionic coming out of the chain ganglia. So this is the synapse. It's happening right here in the chain ganglia. Some of these nerves can also and you can see some of them here. Here's the preganglionic. It's passing over the chain ganglia and going to these collateral ganglia. And there in the collateral ganglia, we see the preganglionic synapsing with the postganglionic, and then the postganglionic coming out and going to the effector organ. So again, some of these nerves will, or some of these preganglionic neurons will synapse in the chain ganglia, and then with the postganglionic, and then the postganglionic will come out and go to the effector organ. Some of them will pass over the chain ganglia, and they will go into the collateral ganglia. And these are actually the sympathetic chain ganglia are called paravertebral because they are on either side of the vertebral column. The collateral ganglia are called prevertebral because they're actually in front of the vertebral column in the abdominal pelvic cavity. So anyway, we see those preganglionic passing over the chain ganglia, or basically in front of the chain ganglia, and going to the collateral ganglia and synapsing there in the collateral ganglia with the postganglionic neuron. Then the postganglionic neuron leaves and goes to goes to the effector organ. Again, the preganglionic axons are going to be very small and myelinated, so we're going to get the signal conducted very quickly from the central nervous system out to those ganglia. And one other thing that we're not really showing here in this diagram, as we said, some of those preganglionic synapse with the postganglionic in the sympathetic chain ganglia, some of those preganglionic synapse with the postganglionic in the collateral ganglia. Then we have a few of the preganglionic neurons that actually synapse with cells of the adrenal medulla, and you actually don't have a postganglionic. Okay, the preganglionic just synapse with the cells of the adrenal medulla, which is the adrenal. It's part of the adrenal gland that's on top of your kidneys, and those preganglionic, those sympathetic preganglionic neurons will stimulate those adrenal medulla cells to release hormones that can then travel through your bloodstream and have effects on different parts of your body as well. And so we'll look at that a little bit more later. So anyway, so again, we have preganglionic synapsing in sympathetic chain ganglia or collateral ganglia, which are both very close to the spinal cord. And then though they synapse with the postganglionic in those ganglia, and then those postganglionic neurons leave that ganglion and they go out to the effector organs, which are going to be, like further away. Like it could be blood vessels in the skeletal muscle. It could be skin. It could be, going to the heart and lungs. It could be going to the digestive organs or the urinary bladder, whatever the case may be. So what we see here, because these ganglia they're right beside or right in front of the spinal cord, we see that these preganglionic neurons are really short. They're not very long at all because they don't have to be, because the ganglia are right there next to the spinal cord. And then we see the postganglionic neurons are very long because those postganglionic neurons move away, or they leave those ganglia, and they have to go all the way to the heart or to the lungs or to the blood vessels in the skeletal muscle or to the skin or to the intestine, whatever the case may be. So this is going to be one of those big differences we'll see between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, is that with the sympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic neurons are really short because they travel to those chain ganglia or collateral ganglia, which are really very close to the spinal cord. They're either right beside the spinal cord or right in front of the spinal cord. So the preganglionic neurons are really short. The postganglionic neurons are very small. They're very long. And this is very important because, again, this sympathetic nervous system is responsible for the fight or flight response. So it's very important. This is your survival. This is determining whether you're going to live or die here. So it's very important for that information that's coming into the central nervous system to be carried out very quickly to get your body to responding the way that you need it to, so that you can survive this, whatever this situation is. And so therefore, having a very short preganglionic neuron allows that central nervous system, that brain and spinal cord, to get that information out, out of the central nervous system and to the body for a response very quickly. So again, structure and function go together. It's the structure of the very short preganglionic neuron is very important because that allows the function, that allows the CNS to get the information for you to respond to this problem that's in your environment very quickly. Okay, so this is going to be the video. It's around 10 minutes, but again, he probably stops with the new information a couple minutes before the end. That gives you a lot of what I just talked about, but it's a lot more visual. He gives you some things you can relate it to. And so again, it's really a good idea for you to watch this video. So when we look at these sympathetic neurons, those preganglionic neurons, there are some different paths they can take, as we just have kind of gone over. We talked about how they can synapse in the chain ganglia, they can synapse in the collateral ganglia, or they can synapse with the adrenal medulla, the cells of the adrenal medulla, which are on top of your kidneys. It's the adrenal gland on top of your kidneys. So basically, we're looking at those three routes, but we have an extra route in here. And again, so what we want to look at here is where is it going, and then what is the effector organ that it's going to. So the first route is through spinal nerves. Okay, basically the preganglionic neuron can synapse in the chain ganglia, and then exit the chain ganglia and go back into a spinal nerve. And then from there, that spinal nerve will innervate the skin and the blood vessels of skeletal muscle. So let's say you're needing to get away from a dog that's after you. Well, okay, this is the route that you're going to take. Why? Well, we need to open up the blood vessels to our skeletal muscles so that our skeletal muscle can get more blood, which means more oxygen, which means more energy, so we can contract that muscle and get the heck out of Dodge and get away from that dog. So this is the route that is going to be used to make sure that skeletal muscle is getting enough oxygen so that it can produce the energy needed to contract and get you out of the danger. So again, basically these preganglionic axons are going to synapse in the chain ganglia, and then the postganglionic neuron will go back into a spinal nerve, and that spinal nerve will innervate your skin and blood vessels of your skeletal muscle. The second route is that we're still going to have our preganglionic synapsing with the postganglionic in the chain ganglia, just like we did here. But here, some of this postganglionic neuron is not going to exit, it's not going to go back into a spinal nerve, it's going to go into a sympathetic nerve. And these sympathetic nerves are then going to innervate things like your heart and lungs in your thoracic cavity, okay? So we can synapse in a chain ganglia, go back into a spinal nerve. That postganglionic neuron goes back into a spinal nerve and innervates the skin and blood vessels. Or that preganglionic can synapse with the postganglionic again in the chain ganglia, but here the postganglionic goes out through a sympathetic nerve and innervates the heart and lungs, which are going to be, thoracic cavity organs. Okay, so in both of these, we have the preganglionic synapsing with the postganglionic in the chain ganglia. The difference is, how does that postganglionic leave? And what is it innervating? So with the spinal nerve, the postganglionic leaves through a spinal nerve and innervates the skin and blood vessels. With the sympathetic, the postganglionic leaves through a sympathetic nerve and innervates the heart and lungs and the thoracic cavity. Okay, our third route, this is going to involve our collateral ganglia. So the preganglionic synapses with the postganglionic in the collateral ganglia. So it doesn't, basically what happens here is that the preganglionic goes through the chain ganglia, but it doesn't synapse with the postganglionic in the chain ganglia. It leaves the chain ganglia as a splanchnic nerve. Okay, so the preganglionic goes into the chain ganglia, but doesn't synapse with anything. It comes directly out as a splanchnic nerve. That's what this is, splanchnic nerve. And then that splanchnic nerve, okay, synapses in the collateral ganglia with the postganglionic neurons. And then those postganglionic neurons go and innervate your abdominal pelvic organs. So that's going to be your visceral organs like your intestines, your gallbladder, your pancreas, your liver, your urinary bladder, things like that. So again, the preganglionic neuron goes through the chain ganglia, comes out as a splanchnic nerve. The splanchnic nerve then goes to the collateral ganglia and synapses with the postganglionic neuron. That postganglionic neuron leaves the collateral ganglia and innervates abdominal pelvic organs. Okay, the last one is innervation of the adrenal medulla. So here, the preganglionic axons synapse with the cells of the adrenal medulla, which is the center portion of the adrenal gland on top of your kidney. And this stimulates that adrenal gland, that adrenal medulla, to produce epinephrine and norepinephrine, which will be released into the bloodstream and act as hormones. They'll travel through the bloodstream, all through the body, and have a widespread effects all throughout the body. Okay, so looking at these again, our spinal nerve route, here we see our preganglionic neuron leaving the spinal cord, synapsing in the chain ganglia with the postganglionic neuron, and this postganglionic neuron leaves through a spinal nerve. And remember, it's going to go to the skin and blood vessels that supply the skeletal muscles. Here's our sympathetic nerve route. Our preganglionic neuron leaves the spinal cord. It synapses with the postganglionic neuron in the sympathetic chain, and it leaves as a sympathetic nerve and innervates organs in our thoracic cavity. Here is our splanchnic nerve root. Our preganglionic neuron goes through the chain ganglia but does not synapse. It comes down here to the collateral ganglia, and there it synapses with a postganglionic neuron. Here, notice it left when it goes through this sympathetic chain. It does not synapse with anything. It comes out, and now we call this a splanchnic nerve. So this is a splanchnic nerve. This is a splanchnic nerve. Okay, so it goes through the chain ganglia, comes out as a splanchnic nerve, synapses in the collateral ganglia with the postganglionic neuron, and then the postganglionic neurons go to innervate the visceral organs in your abdominal pelvic cavity. And then our last root, here we have our preganglionic neuron coming out, going through the chain ganglia, going through a collateral ganglion. Going through a collateral ganglion. So it goes through the chain ganglia, does not synapse, goes through the collateral ganglia, does not synapse, and then goes to the adrenal medulla. Again, this is the adrenal gland on top of the kidney. The adrenal medulla is the center portion of that, and it synapses with cells in the adrenal medulla. It stimulates those cells to release hormones like epinephrine and norepinephrine that will travel through the bloodstream and have widespread effects throughout the body. Okay, so now let's look at the parasympathetic. Remember, we said the parasympathetic is responsible for the rest and digest response, and we said that this division is craniosacral because it involves the cranial nerves, specifically cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10. And it also involves pelvic splanchnic nerves down coming here off of this sacral region. So cranial region involving cranial nerves and sacral region involving pelvic splanchnic nerves. Okay, and we are going to see the ganglia involved here are terminal ganglia. So the preganglionic neurons will synapse with postganglionic neurons in the terminal ganglia. Now these terminal ganglia, guys, they are not right next to the spinal cord. Okay, they are going to be either right next to the effector organ or actually within the walls of the effector organ, okay, such as your intestines or your bladder or something like that. So what we see then is just the opposite of the sympathetic. Remember, with the sympathetic, because the ganglia were right there next to or in front of the spinal cord, the preganglionic neurons were very short and the postganglionic neurons were very long. Well, with our parasympathetic, it's just the opposite because these terminal ganglia are so far away from the spinal cord. The terminal ganglia are right next to or within the organ, the effector organ. We see that the preganglionic neurons have to be very long to get to those terminal ganglia. And then the postganglionic neurons are really short because that ganglion is right there next to the organ that's being innervated, right next to that effector organ. And so the postganglionic neuron is going to be really short. And so then what we have here is just kind of a review or a summary of the differences between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic division. And there is another slide a little bit later on that we'll look at probably tomorrow that will kind of show all these differences and even more differences. But basically, again, remember that your sympathetic division is thoracocolumbar. Your parasympathetic division is craniosacral. Remember that the roots for the sympathetic division, we can have synapsing happening in the chain ganglia, and then the postganglionic neuron leaving as a spinal nerve. We can have synapsing happening in the chain ganglia and the postganglionic neuron leaving as a sympathetic nerve. We can have synapsing happening in the collateral ganglia and the postsympathetic or the postganglionic neuron leaving as a splanchnic nerve. And then again, remember our fourth root is where there is no synapsing in the ganglia. The preganglionic neuron actually synapses with the cells of the adrenal medulla. That's the fourth one. Whereas with our parasympathetic division, we have cranial nerves and pelvic splanchnic nerves are the two roots of the message from the CNS to the effector organs. Again, remember the cranial nerves can be are going to be synapsing in the terminal ganglia, and then the postganglionic neuron leaving from there, as well as the pelvic splanchnic nerves will also synapse in terminal ganglia. Again, remember these terminal ganglia are really close to the effector organs. And again, we just went over this. The sympathetic chain ganglia. The ganglia, you're using the chain ganglia as well as the collateral ganglia. The chain ganglia are used for the spinal and sympathetic nerves. The collateral ganglia are used for the splanchnic nerves. And then remember, for the parasympathetic, you're using terminal ganglia that are on or very near the effector organ. And so that postganglionic neuron is going to be very short, whereas these are a lot longer. And then again, short preganglionic neurons, because those chain and collateral ganglia are so close to the spinal cord, and then long postganglionic, whereas with our parasympathetic, there's a very long preganglionic because the terminal ganglia are so far away from the brain and so far away from the spinal cord, and you have those terminal ganglia are more in your those terminal ganglia are more right. Something's going on outside my window and I'm getting distracted. Sorry. Those terminal ganglia are right next to the effector organ or within the wall of the effector organ, and so the postganglionic neuron will be very short and the preganglionic neuron will be a lot longer. Okay, here is a video, again, around 10 minutes, but probably just a couple minutes shorter than that, that has a lot of information about your about the parasympathetic, and it does, again, go into how the sympathetic and parasympathetic are different in this video as well, so it's a really good idea to watch this video. And it will also talk about the cranial nerves, and remember, the cranial nerves are part of the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, please let me know if you have any questions. Don't forget to answer the questions on the Google form today, and we'll talk to you later. Hope you have a good rest of your week. Bye-bye.